let us move ahead and discuss the next concept, that is separation of lease and non-lease components. So friends, here we are talking about a situation where the lease contract is definitely conveying the right to use a leased asset, but along with that leased asset, the lessor also conveys the right to use other services. In such case, there may be inclusion of lease and non-lease components within a lease contract, which the standard wants to deal separately. That means the lessee should deal with both these components separately. Let me substantiate this by giving an example. Assume that I want to carry out transportation business. I approach a transport company and request them to provide a truck under a lease. Now, I am not going to drive the truck myself, right? I just want to conduct the transport business. So, I will look after the entire business administration and management, and there has to be someone to drive the truck. Transport company has a lot of connections with these drivers and helpers. So, I request them that please also provide me a driver and a helper along with the truck. So, when I make the lease payments to that transport company, I pay for the truck rentals, I pay for the driver's salary, I pay for the helper's salary. So, if you closely look into one thing, the total payment made by me, who is lessee, okay, the total payment made by me includes multiple components. Some are lease components and some are non-lease components. So, standard wants the lessee to separate these lease and non-lease components and account for these separately. So, what should be done for the truck rentals? Truck rentals should be accounted for as a lease components, and that will be accounted for in accordance with Ind AS 116. On the other side, the salary component, that is the salary of driver and salary of helper, will not be considered as lease component and shall be accounted for in accordance with other standards. Whatever standard applies on that particular component, that being a non-lease component, some other standards will apply. So, the relevant standard that applies, you apply that standard. Ind AS 116 in that case will apply only and only to the lease components. Now, while you are dealing with this aspect, you have to be utmost careful about one thing. There may be certain expenses included in the lease payments which you cannot completely consider as lease component or non-lease component. Let me give you an example. Suppose that transport company which has provided me that truck. Now, what will happen when I am using a truck in a transport business? There will be some taxes that are payable to the RTO department, correct? The road transport department, it will levy certain taxes on that truck. Now, myself, I am the lessee, I am using that truck in my transportation business, but that truck does not belong to me by legal title, correct? As per RTO records or as per transport department records, the truck is owned by the lessor. So, when they levy taxes on the truck on annual basis, those taxes will be levied on the lessor and not on me. But lessor would say, when the lessor itself is not using the truck in its business and I am using that truck in my business, logically I should be bearing that expenditure, and lessor would be smart enough to make this point included in the lease contract, that in the event that the lessor makes this payment to the transport department or RTO department, lessor will have right to claim reimbursement from me. And when I make that reimbursement, such types of taxes, insurance, which are generally fixed payments, now you cannot classify these either as lease or as non-lease payments. So, what the standard wants you to do, split this also into two components on some rational proportion basis, that what part will be pertaining to the lease component and what part will be pertaining to non-lease components. So, friends, let me summarize this whole discussion. What all I am going to pay to the lessor in this transport example? I'm going to pay rental of the truck, number one. I'm going to pay driver's salary. I'm going to pay helper's salary, and I'm going to pay the taxes of the truck and insurance premium of the truck. 5 different components included in the lease. How should we deal with this? Point number one, the truck rental, purely lease component. Driver's salary, helper's salary, purely non-lease component. So now we already got separation of lease and non-lease components done. Now how to separate this, I have yet to talk about that. So don't bother about on what basis we are going to separate this. We will learn that in details later. First you understand that you have separated the lease and non-lease components. Now what you need to do, there are 2 expenses which the lessee has to make payment to the lessor by way of reimbursement, and that will be insurance and taxes. This insurance and tax which is on the vehicle, and I have to bear that expenditure, the standard requires the lessee to split that payment also proportionately, some part as lease component and some part as non-lease component. So let me explain this in little more details along with important notes that you should write down. So let us write a note about separation of lease and non-lease components. There may be contracts containing a lease coupled with an agreement to purchase or sell other goods or services. The non-lease components are identified and accounted for separately from the lease components in accordance with other standards. Costs related to property taxes and insurance do not involve the transfer of goods or services. Consequently, if these costs are fixed in the contract, they should be included in the overall contract consideration to be allocated to the lease and non-lease components. Friends, do one thing, first write up this content what you find on screen, and I will be offering some extended explanation to this whole matter in little more details, but first write up what you find on screen. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. So to understand this concept in little more depth, let us move ahead and take some example. So there are 2 parties involved in a contract, the customer and the supplier, or the lessee and the lessor, and the lessee is taking a truck under a lease and the lessor provides a truck along with a driver, and therefore the lease payments made by the lessee to the lessor includes driver's salary as well. So now the total lease payments can be classified or considered as gross contractual payments, and these payments include definitely 2 components. One, that is the truck rentals, which will be considered as a lease component, and the component of driver's salary will be considered as a non-lease component. Let us now extend this example and include one more component, that is the taxes that can be levied on the truck. Truck being a transport vehicle, it will be a subject matter of tax relating to transportation activity. So the transport department shall levy taxes on this truck. We should not forget one thing, that the truck, the asset, is in the name of the lessor. That means the legal title to the truck belongs to the lessor. So as per the transport department records, the owner of the truck is this party, that is lessor, correct? So the taxes will be levied on this party, and it is the lessor who will be responsible for paying taxes. However, the transport business, that is the use of this truck, is being carried out by the lessee or the customer. As a result, it is the lessee's responsibility to pay the taxes to the lessor, and if the lessor has already paid taxes to the transport department, then the lessee has to reimburse those taxes to the lessor. This will be generally their initial understanding while signing the contract. So what happens now is the lease payments will now include driver's salary as well as tax. So what you need to understand is this whole consolidated payment or the gross contractual payment will still be divided between lease and non-lease components. However, the tax component will be excluded while doing so. In other words, the gross contractual payment will first be considered as excluding tax. That means only the two components, truck rental and driver salary, will be separated as lease components and non-lease component, and the tax will be separately allocated between these two components again. That means the tax on an overall basis paid by the lessor to the transport department, that tax will be allocated between lease and non-lease component exactly in the same proportion as it was for the truck and driver's salary. So friends, whatever we have discussed, let us now move ahead and write up a note in respect of this whole matter. So let us write up that note. Reimbursement made by the lessee to the lessor. Payments for maintenance activities and other goods or services transferred to the lessee are considered as non-lease components because they provide the lessee with a service. But in some cases, a lessee may also reimburse the lessor payments that relate to the leased asset for activities and costs that do not transfer a good or service to the lessee. Such costs, for example, taxes and insurance, are considered to be part of the total consideration that is allocated to separately identified lease and non-lease components of the contract. So friends, please write up this whole thing and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Now let us apply this concept in some case study based questions. Let us go ahead and take up question number 16. Let us read this question. Entity L rents an office building from landlord M for a term of 10 years. The rental contract stipulates that office is fully furnished and has a newly installed and tailored HVAC system. It also requires landlord M to perform all common area maintenance during the term of the arrangement. Entity L makes a single monthly rental payment and does not pay for maintenance separately. The office building has a useful life of 40 years and HVAC system and office furniture each has a life of 15 years. What are the units of account in the lease? Indirectly, the question is asking you identify how many components are involved in this arrangement. So what we should do is we should analyze the whole situation and we can find out that there are in total 3 components in the arrangement. One of the component is office building along with HVAC system. Now this HVAC system, can you see it is installed and tailor made. That means this HVAC system is so closely related with building that these cannot be used individually and independently. The use of HVAC system cannot be done without this office building because this was tailor made and designed specifically for this particular building. On the other side, the other asset for which the lease component will exist is the office furniture. Now office furniture can be considered as a separate lease component because office furniture can be used separately as an individual asset without depending on this office building. The third component that we find in the arrangement is about this common area maintenance. The maintenance arrangement is the third component. However, this maintenance arrangement cannot be considered as a lease component. So this maintenance will be considered as a non-lease component. The lessee is making a single monthly rental payment. That means the rental payment includes 3 components. One, for the use of office building along with HVAC. Second, for the office furniture. And third is for the maintenance. So what we can finally conclude is that there are in total 3 components involved in the arrangement, 2 lease components and 1 non-lease component. So let us see how to present the answer. There are three components in the arrangement. The building assets, that is office building and HVAC, considered as a single component, the office furniture as the second component, and the maintenance agreement as the third component. The office building and HVAC system are one lease component because they cannot function independently of each other. The HVAC system was designed and tailored specifically to be integrated into the office building and cannot be removed and used in another building without incurring substantial costs. So friends, do one thing, write up this much part of the answer first and then I give you the later part of the answer. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this part of the answer. Let us move ahead and write up the later part. We would say the office furniture functions independently and can be used on its own. It is also a lease component because it is a group of distinct assets for which entity L directs the use, and the maintenance agreement is a non-lease component because it is a contract for service and not for the use of a specified asset. So do one thing friends, write up these two paragraphs as well and that will be end of the answer. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and now discuss the next point, that is optional exemption of using practical expedient to not to separate non-lease component. Now in this regard, try to understand one thing very clearly. Ind AS 116 has offered a choice to the lessee, that is the lessee can elect, the lessee can choose not to separate lease and non-lease component, and even though the whole contract includes lease and non-lease components together, the lessee can make a choice of not separating them and accounting for the entire lease payment as if it is a single component only and treat it like a lease component. So in such case, if the lessee is making this choice, why is this kind of exemption or why is this kind of election given to the lessee? Owing to the practical difficulty that may sometimes get involved in splitting these payments, the standard has permitted the lessee to do the same thing. However, from lessor's viewpoint, it would be a matter of revenue recognition. So lessor is not allowed to take the benefit of this election. That means lessor is mandatorily required to separate the lease and non-lease components. The lessee has been given a choice that if the lessee is willing to separate, the lessee can do that. If the lessee wants to show the whole lease payment inclusive of lease and non-lease components together, the lessee can make that choice. This could be considered as a practical expedient allowed by the standard. Now, one more very important thing in this case, this should not be cross confused with different lease components. If you can recall the example I have given you earlier, that is lease of building, lease of furniture, lease of equipments, lease of machinery, multiple components included in a lease contract, and if those two conditions are fulfilled, then the lessee must compulsorily show lease of each asset as a separate component. The lessee is not supposed to make that choice or make that election of practical expedient on lease components which are multiple assets. Each asset will be considered as a separate lease if those two conditions that we have discussed earlier are fulfilled. Here the choice is for separating or not separating lease and non-lease components. So friends, in this regard, let us write down some notes. Ind AS 116 provides a practical expedient that permits lessees to make an accounting policy election by class of underlying asset to account for each separate lease component of a contract and any associated non-lease components as a single lease component. Such practical expedient is not permissible for the lessor. Lessees that make such election allocate all of the contract consideration to the lease component. The practical expedient does not allow lessees to account for multiple lease components of a contract as a single lease component if it meets the conditions. So friends, I have already explained you these points. Just take note of this quickly. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and now write up the basis of allocation. If the lessee definitely makes a choice of not separating the lease and non-lease component and account for the whole thing as if it is a lease payment only or as if it is a lease component only, that is just one choice. What if the lessee does not make that choice and the lessee wants to separate the lease and non-lease component and account for these two separately? Then the total payment needs to be allocated between the lease and non-lease component. So we need to understand on what basis will you make allocation. You should not be wrongly driven away by the amounts that you are paying individually, because the prices that you are paying could be manipulated. Therefore, don't look into how much you are paying under the contract. Instead, look into what would be the standalone price, the relative standalone prices for each of these components, that is lease component and non-lease component. If you would have taken that lease component separately, just that, or the non-lease component separately, just that, how much you would have paid individually for each of these. That becomes the kind of fair value of these two components, which we will call as the relative standalone prices of these two components. On the basis of those relative standalone prices, the allocation has to be made. Now, in this regard, another practical difficulty that may arise is the lessee does not have sufficient observable inputs, or you can say does not have sufficient information about relative standalone prices. In such cases, what you can simply do is, as a lessee, you can make estimations, and based on estimations the allocation can be done. That means if you do not have the direct information about the relative standalone prices of lease and non-lease components, you can make your own estimates. Based on that estimation also the allocation can be made. So let us continue to write up that note. So we have already discussed this point as well. Determining and allocating the consideration in the contract. Lessees that do not make such election. Such election means election of not separating lease and non-lease components. So in such cases, lessees are required to allocate the consideration in the contract to the lease and non-lease component on a relative standalone price basis. Now, the question is, what if there is no clear information available with respect to the standalone prices? So, if observable standalone prices are not readily available, lessees estimate standalone prices, maximizing the use of observable information. So, as much information you have in terms of observable information, you may make use of that, and in places where you do not have any observable information, you may make estimates. That is what required by Ind AS 116. So write down this point as well, and then we move to questions.